Well, Natalie, thank you for joining us today.
Great to be with you.
Thank you. I was reading a bit about your background in education, and you've done a few degrees. And
Yes.
I was wondering, how did you envisage yourself as a politician at university?
Oh no, absolutely not. Indeed, I didn't really envision myself as a politician at the start of 2012. I was involved in politics, but I was then mostly a journalist, and I was giving up being a journalist and was planning on writing a book. Working title, Our Economic and Environmental Mess and How We Get Out of It. And then Caroline Lucas rang up and said she wasn't re-standing for Green Party leader, and I put down the phone and said something like, "Oh hell."
Oh, okay. There are a few parties in Europe now. In Greece you have Syriza and Podemos in Spain. Do you think the rise of these parties to power will be good for Europe? And do you think, does the Green Party have close relations with them? Or?
Yeah, I'm very much so. I mean, I'm glad that the Greek Greens were actually part of this Syriza election victory. And there are groups representing them here in London that we have some contact with. And I think it's really a symptom of the fact that whether you want to call it neoliberalism, neo-Thatcherism, the whole ideology of austerity, the whole ideology of greed is good and we can keep trashing the planet and somehow or other it doesn't matter. That ideology has really clearly had its day. It's failed even in its own terms, and it's time for new ways of thinking about politics, new ways of thinking about the economy. And I'd say the two key things in that are that we need to ensure that everybody has access to the resources for a decent quality of life, and we all collectively have to live within the limits of one planet, the environmental limits, because we've only got one planet.
Where do you see these parties in the next six months to a year then?
We're in a very turbulent political period. It's very hard to say what's going to happen. I think predictions is not a game to get into at the moment.
Okay. What's it like as a leader who's not in Parliament directing an MP who is?
Well, I think first of all it's worth saying that directing really isn't the right word in the Green Party. If anyone directs anyone in the Green Party, it's our now 53,000 members who actually tell us what to do, tell us what the policy should be. The Green Party is very much democratic, and so it's a question of policy is decided by the members. We're consulting the members all the time, our democratic structures. And one of the things about being leader who's not in Parliament means that I'm free to travel the country. I mean, I spend a lot of time travelling around the country, and that means I'm much less Westminster and London focused. And that I think is good for the Green Party.
In what sense? Is
it means
raising support, or
both in terms of raising support and also in terms of I was in Harrogate and Sheffield earlier this week, and so I was hearing from people, getting the news of what things are like on the ground, and something that I've found going around the country a lot is rural bus services and bus services outside the big cities. They've been slashed back, and that's a huge issue. And I think no other party is really talking about that, and the Green Party is partly because of what I've seen on the ground.
Sure. I wanted to ask you a few questions about education. There's a lot of talk about, I'm a student at UCL, and there are protests for free education, making education more accessible. What's your stance on this?
We believe that we should have zero university tuition fees. Education is a public good. It's good for all of us, whether it's an MVQ or a BA or a BSc or whatever. It's good for the whole of society for people to get an education. So we believe that should be paid for from general progressive taxation, not be a kind of weight of debt sitting on generations of students.
You appoint people to the House of Lords, even though you want to abolish it. How does that work?
Well, we do indeed. We have one member of the House of Lords, Jenny Jones, and she went in there with the explicit intention of hoping to abolish it. I mean, it's a mechanism that exists that gives us the opportunities to ask questions, to take legislative action. So while it's there, we'll use it, but we're trying to get rid of it along the way.
Well, kind of following on from that, how do you go about formulating policy and coming up with your ideas?
Okay, well, policy in the Green Party, basically at its core, comes from any four members of the party can propose a policy that then goes to conference. There's also the potential for people to amend it along the way, goes to conference, and if conference vote for it, that's our policy. Now, what we've also got is a process of elected policy committee that also regularly looks at policy to check it's up to date, to see that there's nothing that needs to be added or changed. But the whole process is, I think you could probably say, intensely democratic.
Okay. You were on the BBC Politics programme the other day, a few weeks ago, and Andrew Neil ripped into quite a lot of your policies how would you pay for the £72 a week supplement for everyone in the country? Was he wrong in what he had to say?
Well, I think what was failing to be acknowledged is the fact that we'll be announcing a fully costed manifesto at the end of March. And the fact is, this is a very long election campaign because we're in a fixed-term parliament situation. And, I think it's perfectly reasonable to say, wait until March when we'll be announcing the manifesto. All the costs will be in there. And that's the facts of the matter. That's when we'd invite people to, welcome to go over it with a fine-tooth comb. And we can't finalise it until then, partly because we've got spring conference in early March, which is when the members will decide some policy areas. So to make it all fit together, we have to wait until after that to end up with the manifesto. And that also, it's worth saying, is when all the other parties will also be producing their manifestos roundabout.
What do you make of political shows like Question Time or Newsnight or BBC Politics? And do you think, especially for young voters, they should be watching these kind of programmes to get a better understanding of politics? Or
I'd encourage everybody to, inform themselves, take every opportunity to inform themselves about politics. What I'd like to see is those kind of shows becoming much more informative, I guess. They're very often played, as so much of our politics is played, as a kind of, Punch and Judy, people scoring points off each other. And the presenters, making a big fuss about presentational issues and about who told the best jokes and all of those kind of things. Whereas, we need a lot more serious, considered consideration of policy, which is something we're really lacking at the moment. We need to debate about what kind of society we want to have. Get a lot deeper politics, really.
Well, you get a lot of big personalities on these kind of shows, and following on from that, how would you deal with personalities like Putin over Ukraine, or the Greek Chancellor?
I think we've just made a very large leap from Question Time and daily politics, which is a lot of the time more theatre than reality. Whereas when you're talking about dealing with Putin, we're talking about very serious, deadly reality. So it's important to I think not group those two things together. But in terms of the question about dealing with Putin, I think what Britain needs to establish is a place in the world where we're a champion of human rights, a champion of international law. We've got a real history of that. I mean, this year we're looking at the history, the anniversary of the Magna Carta. Britain was responsible and involved in the creation of a lot of our human rights law and international law. And if we move on from being the world's policeman, our role in Iraq and Afghanistan, and move on to being and establishing ourselves over time as a champion of international law and rights, then we can have a role in, and we can start trying to do it now, insisting on those things in dealing with Putin. But also we need to acknowledge that when we're dealing with someone like Mr. Putin, we very much have to acknowledge that if you have a negotiation, he has to be able to walk out with something that he claims as a success. And it's always remembering that the Versailles Treaty was an absolute disaster, and you can that kind of negotiation doesn't work. You have to allow the other side something as well.
You champion a lot of equality in your manifesto and proposals. If you were Prime Minister, would you take a salary above the mean wage?
I think I would take. I think that the Prime Minister is quite a big job. What I'd be doing is making sure, and I think the salary of the Prime Minister is unreasonable. What I'd like to do is we suggest that any organisation the top paid person shouldn't be paid more than 10 times the lowest paid person. So in a way, what I'm much more concerned about is making sure we want to make the minimum wage a living wage. $7.85 around the country, $9.15 in London. And I think if you did that, you'd be getting pretty close. Maybe you'd want to drop the Prime Minister's salary a little to make sure the lowest paid civil servant wasn't paid. Exactly.
Do you agree with some civil servants being paid even more than the Prime Minister, or 3-4 times as much as the Prime Minister?
Well, I mean, I think if you apply that 10-to-1 rule, then I think it's reasonable to say that the Prime Minister's salary should be the top, around about the top salary in the country. And I think we're also talking about the private sector. The reality of salaries has got wildly out of control and is deeply unhealthy, and it's a measure of the much broader problem of inequality in our society.
Where do you see the Green Party in 5 years and at the election in 2020?
I think that's very unpredictable because it kind of depends what happens in 2015, which is still very much up for grabs. If we...
should you gain more influence than...
Well, yes, I'm confident that we'll be much bigger than we are now and we'll have much more impact. What we could see by then is we could see major constitutional reform. We could see a PR upper house and lower house elected, entirely new ways of doing things. If that was to happen, we're in an entirely different political world. And we need to be, because we're facing economic, social and environmental crises and a political crisis, and we need to change the politics to change all those other things as well.
In terms of engaging young voters, what do you think of John Bercow's online voting proposal? Is that something that's feasible? Or?
I think the problem is actually, like a lot of these issues, it's suggesting that the problem is with voters and with the process. I think the problem is the fact that our politics is deeply uninspiring, dull, appears to be entirely irrelevant to people's concerns. The answer is to change politics rather than necessarily change the voting system or change. That's not the key problem. I think you've got to really ask about security issues, and that's a concern. But what I want to do, what I'm more interested in, is good quality politics that speaks to people's concerns.
Yeah. We're going to move on to some more personal questions.
Okay.
You've been a journalist and a politician. Which do you enjoy more?
Well, I think at eeach stage in your life, there's stages in your life when it's right to do different things. I had a lot of fun as a journalist. I enjoyed that. Yeah. But I always knew at some point that you report one more African famine and one more civil war, and it's just too depressing. And I always knew at some point that I'd move on to trying to change the news rather than to report it. I would have expected to go on sort of United Nations campaign group NGO rather than politics, but that's the way it worked out.
What do you think makes a good political leader?
I think empathy, being representing people rather than just going, right, I'm at the front, I'm going to do whatever I want. It's critically important that you understand the social and economic circumstances and really you get where people are at. Yeah. So that understanding, I think, is one of the crucial things.
So following on, Churchill once said, history will be kind to me because I intend to write it. How do you want yourself to be remembered?
I haven't thought about that one very much, to be honest. I'm a journalist, so I might write a memoir one day, I don't know, but I suspect, history comes from lots of different voices, particularly these days in the age of social media and all the rest of it. Sure. And so we've got, a new democratic histories forming. What that will look like, I'm not quite sure.
Who are your idols or source of inspiration whilst growing up?
I grew up I was having a conversation this morning about, did I grow up in a political household? And the answer to that was no. When I was a small child, I knew about rugby league players, was all I knew about. And then when I was a teenager, I started to discover women from history, women like the suffragettes, like the leveller women throughout history who've very much stood up, very often against social mores in the face of ridicule and abuse. Women who've stood up for what they've believed in right through history.
Sure. If there's one thing that you could go back and change during your time at university, or when you were my age, for example, what would it be? Anything you would do differently?
If I was a little bit earlier than that, I went and did agricultural science, and that probably wasn't the degree I should have been doing. But I came from a family where no one had ever been to university before. Yeah. No one could tell me that I wasn't doing the right thing. But now that I've got a science degree, I don't entirely regret it because it's quite useful, both in journalism and politics, to have a science background because most people don't have it.
But are there any decisions you took that you think you could have perhaps done differently?
In retrospect, I'd now have drunk less than I did.
Okay, I'm sure everyone would say that. I'm sure you saw Nick Clegg on The Last Leg recently.
I confess I didn't actually. In terms of, I believe in a work-life balance. I just don't have one.
Sure. Okay. If I put you in the hotspot and said you have a minute to convince me on why to vote, what would you say?
Why to vote at all? I would say that if you don't vote, if you follow the brand, don't vote, it only encourages the message. Sure. What will actually happen is you'll be counted at the I was happy enough with how things are that I didn't bother group. Yeah. So it's critically important for young people particularly, but for everybody, to register to vote. First of all, make sure you'll be able to vote, and then to go along to the polling station. Obviously, I'd like you to vote Green, but even more than that, I'd urge you to vote for the person, party or policies you most believe in. Do some research, get along to a hustings if you can, see the candidates in action, look at the websites, read up the policies, and vote for what you believe in. Because if we're going to get a different kind of politics in Britain, we need far more people voting, and we need them voting for what they believe in.
Good advice. On that, what was the best advice you were ever given?
Many years ago, I was told that don't hold yourself responsible for the actions of other adults. You can, you can help people, you can support them, and you can encourage them, but people have to make their own choices in life, and you can't be held responsible for the choices they make.
Sure. And differently, what's your favourite type of music?
Well, this is where I come to the fact that I was thrown out of the primary school choir for being utterly tuneless. So I'd say my favourite. I would say my favourite sort of music is music where the words are more important than the actual sounds. I like music that's kind of poetry, really.
Sure. So, any favourite artists? Or?
I often go back to, and this really dates me, and I don't expect most people watching this will have ever heard of them, but there's a band in Australia called Red Gum, who are a big sort of protest political band.
Yeah.
They did some great anti-Vietnam War songs and some very important songs about the treatment of the Aborigines in Australia, and so I'd go back to them.
And finally, Muhammad Ali once said, a man or a woman who views the world the same at 50 as he did when he was 20 has wasted 30 years of his life. Forgetting the ages involved, how do you view the world now compared to when you were 20?
Oh, I think it's changed enormously. 20 was just at the point where I was really, and this is a sad indictment of my education. At about 20, I was starting to learn to think critically about the world. Yeah. I'd been through, an education system that had taught me to rote learn and pass exams. And actually, when I was 20, while I was doing an agricultural science degree, I was doing philosophy as a non-degree subject. And that was really the starting point at which I started to really analyse and look critically at the world. So, it's been a journey on since that point.
So would you say humanities are sort of better in forming personality than sciences, or?
I think it's really important to come from both perspectives, and I think that's one of our real problems is the siloing of the division, and indeed not just the sciences and the humanities, but the whole very narrow subject areas. And there's been a lot of talk about multidisciplinary work, but not a lot of action.
Yeah. So is that something you change?
I'd certainly very much want to encourage that, and encourage people to go a very long way down the road studying both humanities and the sciences.
Yeah, I think we're good for time. So
okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, good stuff. Thank you. Cheers.